Thank you, Chairman Flake, Ranking Member Markey. I have 3 points today about the utility of targeted bilateral U.S. sanctions, and I'll conclude by highlighting how each applies to the troubled case of Zimbabwe. My first point is that U.S. bilateral sanctions are a visible and potent signal from the world's most powerful nation. If you steal elections, you don't get to send your kids to school in Boston. If you rob public coffers, you don't get to invest in California real estate. If you mistreat your own people, you don't get to seek medical care in Houston hospitals. Sanctions against the most oppressive, violent, and kleptocratic regimes could even be used more frequently. For example, I believe it's past time for the U.S. to take a hard look at sanctions against political leaders in the Gambia. Second point is that well-crafted and aggressively executed targeted sanctions can have a significant impact on influencing the decisions and policies of regimes and bad actors. Both financial sanctions implemented by the Treasury Department and travel sanctions imposed by the State Department can have traceable effects when policymakers have very clear and concrete objectives in mind, and especially when the intelligence community is given the time and means to find financial levers and vulnerabilities. Third, regime change is the wrong metric for success. No one claims, nor should anyone expect, that targeted bilateral sanctions on their own will bring down a regime. Sanctions complement rather than replace our other diplomatic, economic, and military tools. So how do each of these points apply toward U.S. policy in Zimbabwe? The current legislation, known as ZDERA, includes a call for travel and economic sanctions against individuals, specific individuals who are believed to be responsible for violence and the breakdown of the rule of law in that country. Point one, U.S. sanctions have been a very powerful and visible bipartisan signal of U.S. policy of standing firm on democracy. ZDERA was co-sponsored by senators from across the political spectrum: Bill Frist, Jesse Helms, Russ Feingold, Joe Biden, and Hillary Clinton. The executive branch sanctions advocated by ZDERA were not directed at the country as a whole, but aimed at specific individuals. Unfortunately, as of 2016, none of the key ZDERA conditions have been met, either in letter or in spirit. Those are restoring the rule of law, holding free and fair elections, and depoliticizing the security forces. Point two, the lack of Zimbabwe's progress to date is not an indicator that sanctions per se have failed. Zimbabwe's decline continues primarily because of an entrenched, highly abusive regime combined with very unhelpful regional dynamics. The European Union's weak and deeply misguided move last year to lift most sanctions on Zimbabwe is not a path the United States should follow. Before we change course, we must ask whether the removal of U.S. sanctions will advance U.S. policy goals, or will the removal play into the hands of the regime. In my view, lifting sanctions at this time will merely strengthen Robert Mugabe and the cabal around him by providing a major propaganda victory. The regime will claim that it has vanquished its imperialist oppressors, and it now has formal American endorsement. Point three, sanctions against Zimbabwe would be much more effective if they were embedded in a broader strategy that included other tools of U.S. power and influence. The United States has generally disengaged from Zimbabwe in recent years, leaving our policy little more than sanctions plus humanitarian assistance. Rather than throwing up our hands or acquiescing in the face of difficulties, we must engage with allies to support democratic forces in the country rather than abandon them. The sanctions list itself could be used more creatively to encourage positive behavior and increase U.S. influence in a post-Mugabe transition. In fact, the U.S. government should be preparing specific targets and options for further ratcheting up pressure, which could be deployed as necessary. This absolutely must include the United States continuing to collect information on certain politicians who one day should face charges of embezzlement and war crimes. Finally, one additional related point. Zimbabwe is today taking steps to try to borrow again from the international financial institutions. As the recent letter from Chairman Corker to Treasury Secretary Liu makes clear, it is premature for the United States to support any new lending to the government of Zimbabwe. Preconditions must include meaningful reforms rather than simple technical targets. Before asking for more funding from the international community, Zimbabwe must also account for the billions of dollars in missing diamond revenue. Most of all, the United States should insist that Zimbabwe's government acknowledge and take responsibility for gross human rights violations committed by state agents, such as the Bellyland massacres and, just 15 months ago, the abduction and probable murder of human rights activist Atai Dzamara. Until the government of Zimbabwe has met the Zadera conditions, it is not yet time for the U.S. to abandon its targeted sanctions. More broadly across Africa, sanctions will continue to be both a practical and symbolic tool for U.S. policymakers, provided they are carefully targeted, deployed among other policy tools, and not expected to serve as a substitute for other actions. Thank you.
Thank you.